This week really slowed things down. Only 5 chapters were covered, but it gave the story a lot of time to flesh out and maintain a pretty good pace. I think the pacing will probably be good for the rest of the season since we're getting a lot more big fights, which take less time to adapt in the anime than they would in the webtoon. Even though the episode was pretty good, there was still some things that were left out, so I'll be going over everything the anime skips to give you guys a fuller understanding of the story. God of High School Episode 8, Close/Friend, covering chapters 56 through 60. The first part of the episode covers chapter 56 pretty well, although there's some slight differences, and I'd argue that there's a little more nuance in the webtoon. The opening scene covers the aftermath from Jugok vs. Jigal from last week's episode. In the anime, Jason and Mujin are having a pretty casual conversation, and Bangshim is healing Jugok. Overall, I'd say that it's pretty emotionless, and Jason doesn't even seem that mad or upset about what happened to his grandson. In the webtoon, this scene is actually full of life. There's a lot more emotion, and it actually starts with a funny scene with Mubong. So Mubong's sitting there with Jason, and since he knew Jugok was his grandson, he was actually expecting Jugok to put in a pretty good fight and potentially even win against Jigal. So we get this funny scene where Mujin's just thinking in his head that he thought Jugok would win and how awkward it is sitting with Jason after he just got destroyed. Then we get a scene that shows the relationship between the six and how they like to have some sort of control over one another. Because when Jason calls Bangshim smiles and says that Jason owes him something now. One other thing that was skipped here was Sunga's first impressions of Jigal. After watching the fight, she immediately could tell that that was the person who crippled her sister. Ilpyo confirmed this, but was able to calm her down so they would get ready for their next match. After the opening of the anime, the next scene shows the third match of the Nationals. The main difference I've noticed in the anime matches is that the characters aren't fighting more than once. In the webtoon, after a character won one match, they would fight again, normally losing, but setting their fresh teammate up with an advantage after doing some damage to the person they lost to. This isn't really a big change, but it did add some depth and mind games to the fights in the webtoon. With that being said, the score of this match changed a bit in the anime. The first fight was Hyungbok vs. Seokwoo, and in the anime it wasn't even a fight, we just got a scene with Hyungbok lying on the ground after being defeated. The webtoon still wasn't a big fight, but it was more than this at least, and Hyungbok looked a lot more formidable. After he received instructions from Ilpyo, he was actually able to win the first match. And since he lost in the anime, his next fight was completely cut. It was Gungdo vs. Hyunbok. It was a complete wash in the webtoon, and it kind of makes sense why it was skipped in the anime to save some time. But the next scene in the anime was Sunga vs. Gangnam. The fight was pretty straightforward, and it was almost a one-to-one adaptation of the webtoon since Sunga still ended up winning in a very quick manner. The next part of the anime rolls into chapter 57, and this is where I see a lot of people have been having some major issues with the portrayal of Gi Gleam. I do have to admit, they did my guy a bit dirty in this scene, but just like some of the other changes, he's a pretty minor character, and he doesn't really have a role in the rest of the story after this one match, so although I see why some people are upset, to me at least, it's really not that big of a deal. Anyway, the fight between Sunga and Gi was completely skipped. Although it was a wash, the fight being cut also meant some of Gi's character was lost with his weird quirk with earwax. And yes, I just said earwax, and yes, it's also pretty gross. But at the end of the fight, he tends to take the loser's earwax, and he did this to Sunga. On one hand, yes, it was unique, it was cut, and all of these Gi fans really wanted to see it. On the other hand, it was nasty. I can see why the anime didn't want to incorporate it, and it also didn't make a difference in the next fight anyway. The next fight in the anime was Gi vs. Ilpyo. The first half of the fight is pretty much the same, but Gi really was done dirty in the next part of the fight, which rolls into chapter 58 of the webtoon. In the anime, Ilpyo basically neg-diffed him. It didn't matter what Gi did, Ilpyo was really able to counter it very easily, and nothing really came of it. And even Gi's Chariot was neg-diffed by Ilpyo. In the anime, his Chariot also looked very bland as it was just a big ball of darkness with some arms and stuff, but the webtoon handled Gi very differently. In the webtoon, even though Gi was handled differently, it was still clear to everyone that Ilpyo was superior. but Gi got some solid hits off and his Chariot looked a lot better. In fact, his Chariot got a name, it was called Jack the Ripper, and since it looked so cool, it was a fan favorite. Even with these changes, the result remained the same and Ilpio won the match for his team. One other thing that wasn't shown that was pretty interesting to me was the discussion between the 6 members after the match. After seeing Gi use his Chariot and Ilpio winning with a kick, some of the 6 members were disappointed that Ilpio was a genuine fighter instead of a Chariot user. Then they had a debate on which was better, ending with Bongchim noting that Taijin, a genuine member, wiped out the 6 by himself, which was a pretty good argument to why genuine fighters might be stronger than Chariot users. The next scene with the trio walking home from the tournament actually combined chapters 60 and 58. So the actual scene of them walking was in chapter 60, but most of the conversation was pulled from chapter 58. The conversation part in chapter 58 was while they were watching Ilpio's team fight. This was with Mira, Mori, and Daiwi all talking about borrowed powers, and Mori ended up telling Mira that he didn't want to learn a borrowed power and he wanted to rely on his own strength instead. The next scene in the anime again combines things from multiple chapters. Originally, Ilpio's flashback and scuffle with Mori were separated, but in the anime these scenes were all put together in one big conglomerate. Anyway, the anime shows Ilpio greeting Mori, then they have their brief fight. It was a pretty good adaptation of the scene in the webtoon and it looked really good. I like that they kept the scene of Ilpio flipping Mori and then the two being in a deadlock with both being able to land their finishing blows on one another. Now back to the anime. After the brief scuffle, Ilpio has a flashback where he tells Mori about his relationship with Taijin. The flashback was pretty solid in the anime. It showed Ilpio's sad story, then Taijin giving him his grandfather's martial arts book. But the webtoon handled this differently. It actually placed the flashback during Ilpio's fight with Gi, probably since it was a slightly more serious fight in the webtoon, which would make it necessary of a flashback. The flashback also showed more on Ilte and Taijin's relationship and their time fighting together as part of the Renewal Taekwondo Force, but this will probably be shown later in the series. So I'm really not too stressed about this change for now, because I guess they'll probably put all of this stuff together, I'd say maybe around episode 10, if the pacing continues as it is now. After the flashback, the anime jumps back to Jigal attacking Mori, with Ilpio blocking it. The scene was almost identical in both versions, but the only difference was Mori's reaction to the attack. In the anime, Mori was a lot more disappointed and hard on himself for leaving his vitals open twice, but in the webtoon, Mori simply acknowledges it and was pretty nonchalant about the whole situation. The next scene in the anime of Q getting obliterated by Mujin for not knowing his place was pulled from chapter 56 of the webtoon, but I actually like the scene a lot better in the anime in this case. And this is a trend that I've noticed with God of High School and even Tower of God. Whenever stuff isn't cut from the webtoon, the adaptation is actually a lot better than the webtoon. And this is just because in general, the anime should look better than a webtoon since everything's in motion, so when things are kept the way they were, the adaptation's actually very, very enjoyable. Before the last major section of the anime, there was one more thing skipped from chapter 60 that I want to point out. It's not really that big of a deal, but it did give some hints to set up the next fight in the tournament. It was this scene where Mira saw someone with her sword. The webtoon, it was just a brief hint, but you could start piecing some things together and it really helped set the scene for the next fight, which is going to happen next episode. Then going back to the anime, the next part of it covered Mori's flashback of Taijin leaving him, and then Mira and Daiwi busting in celebrating his birthday. This scene is also a one-to-one adaptation from the webtoon, and I think it's better in the anime as well. The only scene that was slightly different was when Mori received information about Taijin. In the webtoon, a person handed him the letter in person, while in the anime, the letter was just left at a door, but again, this is really a non-issue. In fact, I would argue that it actually makes more sense that Mori doesn't see the person, because in the webtoon, after receiving the letter, the person pretty much disappears. And that's it for the episode. As I said in the beginning, pacing is starting to get a lot better week by week, and when the anime doesn't skip stuff, it's actually better than the webtoon. And that's it for the video. If you have any suggestions or love God of High School, leave it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.